Greetings to the family. Sovereignty, that's the question that we want to talk about today. Sovereignty, what's the difference between political sovereignty versus divine sovereignty? What do we even mean by divine sovereignty? These are the questions that I want to talk about today. Sovereignty is something that has caught the attention of many in recent times. In particular, you hear about things like the sovereign movement. Okay, you hear about groups like the Moors, or the Moorish nation in the Americas, and particularly in the USA, and they talk about being sovereign citizens. Okay, and the whole idea of nationality. We're not going to talk about the Moors. I'm not qualified to go up on it like that by myself, but that's a very important topic. We're not going to talk about nationality per se, but we're going to talk about the difference between political sovereignty and divine sovereignty, and we're going to focus on this idea of divine sovereignty. The reason why there's so much focus on on sovereignty recently is that the more people feel that their freedoms are being taken away, the more they're going to look more closely into who they are and how they can be free. That's the reality. And particularly if they come from places like America, which was, founded on this idea of freedom. They have a constitution which guarantees rights. The more people feel that they're being put in a box and that the world is being run by a group of elites, and this is the type of information that is being put out in the public, the more they're going to be interested in these ideas of how to establish themselves as sovereign citizens, as free men. Okay, and that's what we're going to get into today, the idea of sovereignty. So please leave your comments below on any of the things you find interesting or important, or even if you disagree with me, leave your comments below in the video so that we all can learn from each other, okay, about this concept of sovereignty, and in particular divine sovereignty, and what that might mean to us. So to start with, let's look at the actual definition of sovereignty. The resource I'm going to use just for a minute is the Oxford English Dictionary, and it talks about sovereignty. And one of the definitions, the first main definition, is sovereignty is to do with the supreme power or authority. I mean, you could do a whole, lecture on those terms themselves. Supreme power or authority. In particular, that word authority is very important. Okay, and it says as a sub definition to that, the authority of a state to govern itself or another state. Okay, so sovereignty is relating to the authority of a state. What gives someone permission? What gives someone the right to govern a state? Well, if you have sovereign power, you have that right to govern another state. Okay, and a self-governing state is the last definition. Sovereignty has to do with a self-governing state, and all of these things, even though they're more to do with the concept of political sovereignty, they're going to become important in our discussion about divine sovereignty as well. So I just put my phone on mute. When it comes to sovereignty, let's look at the etymology of it. Sovereign meaning coming from the old French souverain, which is to say sovereign, lord, or ruler, or highest, supreme, or chief. Okay, it also referred to the idea of sovereign money, or the gold coins that were used. And why? Because obviously that coinage was the property of the supreme ruler, of the king. So they called them sovereigns, right? So again, all of the definitions go along that line of supreme, okay, highest, authority, ruler. So sovereignty has to do with that. And the sovereign, well, the sovereign obviously is the one that has that authority, that is the supreme, that's considered the supreme, that is the ruler of that particular state or people or nation or whatever you might be referring to. Now, this idea of sovereignty is something that has been looked into for many years. But from an academic purpose, we can look at some of the research. And from when I was doing my own research, they were talking about the fact that one of the first academic research published works on sovereignty was from a gentleman, Jean Bodin, and his 6 Livres de la République, or that is to say 6 books of the Republic, published in 1576. And I'll leave links for my references that I'm using below. And it talks about that this book provides the first coherent theory. Okay, so it's a theory of someone, because as I said, this idea of sovereignty has been discussed for, millennia, I'm sure, even as far back as to Aristotle and Socrates, and most likely before that. They just would have used different terminology, but the idea of supremacy and rulership and authority, we know even from a biblical sense, is something that is, and we're going to talk about that, something that's long been established. But when we look at some of the academic considerations of it, if we look at Bodin talks about that, first of all, it's separate, sovereignty, can be separated from the person of the sovereign. Now, this is really important to understand in terms of political sovereignty. So if you look at one of the best examples, if you look at the Queen Elizabeth II of England, she's the regent, okay, of the United Kingdom. And so she's the supreme ruler, but her sovereignty, or the sovereignty of her as a ruler, is not connected to her body physical. Okay, so meaning if she passes on, if and when she passes on, that doesn't mean her sovereignty ends there. No, she is just the holder of that particular station, of that particular office, of the particular representation of the sovereign supreme rulership, okay, of her royal family, in this case, over the United Kingdom, aka what they call Great Britain previously, Great Britain and the United Kingdom. All right, so that's an important distinction that Bodin is making. Secondly, Bodin talks about that the sovereign authority cannot by definition be subject to any rule or restriction. Hence why when you look at the British royal family and the Queen is exempt from the laws that generally govern her subjects. Okay, and I'm just talking the facts. If you look up these the particulars of how the royal family relates to the rest of the citizenship within the United Kingdom and Great Britain, there's a clear distinction made, because the sovereign, as Bodin says, cannot by definition be subject to any rule or restriction. Why? Because they are the supreme ruler. So how could you have any rules or restrictions that relate to the one that the rules actually emanate from? Now, this is all to do with political sovereignty, but as I said before, it's going to become important to our discussions on divine sovereignty. Now, when it comes now to sovereignty, we need to think about how it's established, okay? And this relates to a very fascinating and very deep subject, what is called international law. So international law will be the laws that govern and help to govern the relationships between nation states globally. All right, international law, and it's a huge area. And as we know, with most law and most legal terminology, it can be quite complex, and there's lots to study, because it's all about relationships and it's all about agreements. Okay, that's what law is all about. You can establish a law, but unless you have the relationships to enforce that and to agree upon those things, then you're either going to do things by force or you do things by consensus. So international law. Now, in the international law, we need to consider how sovereignty is established. What makes someone or an entity have that supreme rulership, have that very important word, that authority to set the rules for others. Okay, and there's only a certain set amount of ways that can be said. And if we look at straight from Wikipedia, it does a nice summary of this. How can sovereignty be established? Well, you can do it through secession, which is where you transfer territory from one state to another. Okay, usually by means of a treaty. You can do it by occupation, so that means that they don't want to secede, so you're just going to go and occupy that particular territory or state. Okay, you can do it by prescription, they say, which is basically where you're given control of a territory or state because no one else is controlling it, or you have to control it. Operations of nature, so in other words, a river might cut off a particular area from everyone else, and so you have a people that live in that area, and so they are the sovereign, establish themselves as the sovereign rulers of that particular area. Okay, creation, which is a very interesting aspect of sovereignty, because creation talks about the process which new land is claimed from the sea. Okay, so for example, in the Netherlands they talk about where you can make new lands, or in the Middle East and Abu Dhabi and those places they've made new land, and so the nation states that would have made those lands would then become sovereign. And this is really important in terms of space and outer space, isn't it? Because where there were no people before, space is governed by its own international laws, but obviously international laws are sometimes there to be broken according to people's military power. So that's a very important aspect. Then you also have the idea of adjudication, okay, which is where you have a third party who rules on that. And most of all, what's happened in the past, conquest. Okay, so we think about Christopher Columbus, for example, and the Spanish. We talk about the British Empire. We talk about the United States and its rampant colonialism around the world. They established sovereignty through conquests in many, if not most, of the places where their sovereignty was established and is still probably holding establishment to this day. So that's political sovereignty, and those are the ways that you can assert sovereignty onto a place or onto a people. Very important. But how does that relate to the topic that I want to focus on, which is divine sovereignty? Okay, so we already said that sovereignty relates to the authority, the supreme rulership over something. Okay, so if we look at the word sovereignty, we already have a definition for that, and we know that divine tends to relates to the Most High, to the origin of all things. You know, to put it in a more of a light term, to God and to the Creator, depending on what your sense of spirituality is. The divine normally relates to God or to the Creator, isn't it? Okay, we know that. So when we talk about divine sovereignty, we're talking about the sovereignty then, the authority then that has come through that divine source. That's what we're talking about. And how does that differ than political sovereignty? Well, we just said that that political sovereignty can come through those 5 different things. Cessation, occupation, prescription, operations of nature, creation, adjudication, and conquest. Okay? But divine sovereignty, and before I move on to that, the idea with sovereignty, if sovereignty, political sovereignty, can be obtained through those, 6, 7 different methods, then surely it also can be taken away from someone else. That's it with political sovereignty, and this is why we see so much interest in the sovereign movement and being a free man and, you know, sovereign citizen movement, is because people feel that their independence and their ability to govern themselves is being taken away. And it just showed you with those different concepts within international law that there are methods, obviously, then that could be employed. In particular, this idea of conquest. You think that you're sovereign over yourself, or over your family, or over your community, over some land, and all of a sudden somebody who has more political might or political influence than you, or more military might, can then take that away. Okay, we see that on a daily basis going on around the world. But divine sovereignty is different, because, as we said, the supreme authority and the power, the authority, the authority that has given the power of rulership is the divine. And there's no higher force, there's no higher source, there's no higher authority than the divine. Okay? So for me, what's divine sovereignty? Well, while we all can say that we are citizens of some particular place or another, we also know that the idea of divine sovereignty, for me, is actually established through birth. Okay? Your divine sovereignty, that authority for you to have free will, okay, and where you were given your own free mind, was established at the point at which you were given life. Okay? And no one can pinpoint that particular time and in as an exact moment. But when that sperm and that egg, that mother and father, came together, and that life force was then created, when that spark of life, because just because the sperm and the egg come together, that doesn't mean that the spark of life to create a new living being, it's always happened. So we're talking about when that spark of life is imparted to that living being, who then establishes their independence when the mother in particular, and aided by whoever, the medical professionals or midwife, then cuts that cord and says, now you're free. Okay, you're an individual. That's the establishment of your divine sovereignty. Okay, right there. And we have certain demarcation, so each one of us can look down and see that we have the remnants of an umbilical cord. Even if you were conceived in vitro, that in vitro embryo still has to be placed in a mother, whether it's the actual mother or surrogate mother, and the placenta has to then be established to that mother in order to allow the nutrients from that mother to then help to energize that growth of that living being physically. Okay? And we all have that. There's no human being that does not have that. And if you don't have one, then we know that there's something up. Okay? And so that's an example. That is an artifact of your divine sovereignty having been established through the womb of your mother. But in particular, the womb is there to nurture and cultivate the physical structure. But the consciousness of that living being was not put there by the mother or the father. Okay? That doesn't come through the placenta, the consciousness. At least not in the way that modern science can explain. So the divine sovereignty, that authority, that consciousness, that free will has been put there by the ruler of all things, the Most High, whatever way you would like to define that, the great source, the place from which that consciousness came and from which that consciousness then will return, which is unexplainable. That is, to me, the establishment of the divine sovereignty. Now, the thing about it is that because it wasn't given to you by anyone else. It cannot be taken away by anyone else. If you think you can be put in a jail cell in the most isolated condition, you know, in isolation, and locked up and tied up and everything, okay, in the dark and the most horrendous of conditions, but no man, no woman, no entity can take away your divine sovereignty ever. Okay? And once you understand that your divine sovereignty, your right to live, was established by the Most High, okay, by the Creator, then it changes your perspective to everything else. Okay? The idea that you are a free man, no matter the chains and shackles on your hands or your feet, or the chains or shackles on your mind, as long as you have your free will, which is in here, okay, your consciousness, you are the divine sovereign of your consciousness. There's no one else. You can change your mind and let people change your mind according to what you will. Because remember, let's go back to what we said, so to the beginning, the definition. Sovereignty, the supreme power or authority. Teach your children that they are the supreme power and authority of themselves, no one else. Yes, if you want to make a decision being influenced by someone else, that's on you. That's on you. But you are the supreme power and authority, and that's been established from a divine source and not from any source. Not even your mother nor your father has the authority to do those things. Obviously, when you're younger, you need to listen to your mothers and fathers because they're teaching you, hopefully, the positive ways, the ways of the world. They help to feed, clothe, and shelter you. Okay? And you need to then defend your sovereignty at all costs. That's what it's all about, isn't it? And in this world that we live in, is 2021. When I'm making this video, it's the end of 2021, December. We're living in a world where we have the COVID pandemic, a world where increasingly people are being told what to do, how to think, when to think, and you know, there's increasing control over your movements. And of course, this is where eventually the world will be going, the world, external world, the world underneath the control of governments, because people are thought to not be able to take care of themselves. That's the idea that is being put towards many of the populace, that you are not actually capable of taking care of yourself. You're not capable of being independent, which we know is not true, because we've been around for a long time. People, human, okay? And we've established great things for a long time without the need for others to tell us what to do. Now, as we look to wrap up, we have to understand that this concept that no one can take this divine sovereignty away from you, and that you must defend that at all costs. Okay? You are sovereign over your divine consciousness. And that sovereignty was given to you under the authority of the Most High. So that's the difference between political sovereignty and divine sovereignty. So while your physical body may be able to be oppressed, you think about people like Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners, well, the reality is that oppression is trying to take a hold of you in different ways every day. You look at the media, all of the negative news stories that are coming from the media, you know, things along those lines. While that physical body, or even the mental body, mental mindset is attempted to be influenced by negative things and trying to take control of your consciousness. Okay? Once you understand that you are a divine sovereign being and that you don't have to answer to anyone else, then it affords you a new level of what in, for example, in America, the founding fathers would call liberty. Okay? Which is to say freedom, liberation. Okay? That no one else can take from you. all right, and that you can put yourself in alignment with that divine source, because it's from that divine source that your sovereignty was established. So that's my concept, my actualization and visualization of divine sovereignty. And you can understand why it's so important in terms of that, because it means that you could never be conquered. You could never be conquered if you understand that you're a divine sovereign being, and that if you teach this to your children, as we said, that sovereignty is not something that is inherited from person to person. It's something that's established through that divine source. So it's something that will continue throughout eternity if we establish that. Okay? And that's the supreme rule over yourself. Then it's either you're good to yourself or you're bad to yourself. And depending on how you are, you're going to have different results. So please go ahead, do your own research. Give me your thoughts on the concept of divine sovereignty and what it means to you. And if you look around the world at various cultures that are more in touch with nature, more in touch with the laws of the universe, the native First Nation peoples of the Americas, the Aborigines of Australia, okay, the Hindu people within the African continent, like the Zulu, Ethiopia in particular, and the Ethiopians and Kemet. And if we look at many of those places, the Inca and the Aztecs, and we see how they treated rulership, but the rulership that they talked about came from a divine source, and a lot of that's been parodied by many of the more modern parlances of the ideas of sovereignty. Okay, I'm not going to get into that right now, but I would suggest you do your own research. This is Dr. David Roots, David Roots TV. Give thanks for listening.